Good morning. I'm Bryan Willson. I'm the director of the Energy Institute at Colorado State University, where I also serve as a professor of mechanical engineering. But relative to this, I had the good fortune to serve from 2012 to 2016 as a program director at ARPA-E, and I'm going to be talking today about that experience. We also have another former program director, Howard Brantz, and Howard and I joined about the same time. Howard joined a couple of months before I did, and we had the experience of working with some of the smartest people in the room around energy, around developing technology, and around getting it to scale. So we want to share that with you today. I want to start off by saying that this is not, even though I was at ARPA-E and still serve as essentially a consultant, a special government employee to the agency, this is not an ARPA-E presentation. None of these materials have been approved by or endorsed by ARPA-E. Potential funding opportunities in the future are all subject to the availability of funds and the whims of government. So this is our sort of forward-looking disclaimer statement. Terry talked about the success that Colorado has had with ARPA-E, but it didn't start that way, and that's actually one of the reasons that we're holding this workshop. A little bit of the history. The actual genesis of ARPA-E was over here in 2005 with the commission that ultimately published a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and in 2008, 2007, that recommended the formation of a DARPA-like agency for energy. So it was really proposed under the W. Bush administration. It was funded in 2008 under the first days of the Obama administration. So really you could say it had parents across the aisle. But the first funding came out in 2009, and this was what we call an open solicitation. And basically an open solicitation is just send us your cool ideas in energy. We put at CSU, we put together teams, we put together, I don't know, we probably put in over a dozen pre-proposals, and half a dozen of those was selected or for a full proposal. None of those were ultimately selected. In fact, there were no awards in Colorado from any of the universities from NREL. I think Coors Tech might have gotten an award. So we basically were batting zero in the 09 solicitation. And when the awards came out, I looked at the list of what was funded, and it's like, that's crazy stuff. We gave you projects that would work, and you funded crazy stuff. And so that's, if there's nothing else you get from today, that's kind of what they're looking for. They are looking for a risk profile that's very different than typical funding agencies. If you write a proposal the way that you would for National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy, it's probably not going to be successful. It's about taking risks, it's about big ideas, things that would have impact if they worked, and as Alan said, it's also about personal relationships. And the last thing I'll say is at the very end, I am going to make a pitch that if you're interested, ARPA-E can be a great place to spend a few years, lots of fun, and the ability to spend $100 million and change the world is a pretty cool thing. But since the first funding, ARPA-E has basically deployed about $2 billion of funds, or at least has selected projects with about $2 billion, over 500 projects. And now I'm going to talk about sort of the structure of the agency. Oops. So the mission of ARPA-E really is around three things. It's around reducing energy imports. It's around improving the efficiency of energy utilization, and it's about reducing the environmental consequences of energy production and use. But it also has an overriding theme of enhancing U.S. competitiveness by allowing us to build future energy industries. It also has a very unique risk profile. ARPA-E funds projects that have considered to be too high risk for other government agencies or for private industry. And that risk can be technical risk, that you're doing something that violates, that's really technically hard. We actually talk about sometimes when we're reviewing proposals on, how many miracles are required for this to work. If it's one miracle, that may not be our risk profile. On the other hand, if it's like 4 miracles, then that may be, that may be, might be a bit too speculative. But the risk can be technical risk, or it can be market risk. So one of our programs, Impact, was around carbon capture and utilization, storage and utilization. And the challenge there was there's hard science problems, but there's also a really hard market problem. So they were taking risks in that area. ARPA-E tends not to fund incremental improvements. We'll talk about this later. Department of Energy has been very effective in areas like photovoltaics in, over the years, investing with a long-term roadmap, incrementally improving performance, driving down costs. That's been great for those industries. That's not what ARPA-E does. They look for the big bet that would fundamentally disrupt and transform the industry. ARPA-E typically doesn't co-fund with other agencies. If another funding agency, I've had projects that I funded, and then simultaneously another agency funded it as well. Typically with other government agencies, that's considered to be a success. For us, that's a problem. If another agency chose to fund that project, it probably means it wasn't risky enough. I'm just going to talk about, in some ways, we embrace failure, and talk about failure as a success. One of the projects I was fortunate to fund in 2012, in the 2012 open solicitation, was concept around fabric-covered wind turbine blades. The idea that if you basically built a kind of a metal structure and covered it with, fabric, sort of like the wing of a Cessna, you could make much larger, lighter, and cheaper wind turbine blades. And they were looking at, very credible evidence that they could maybe reduce weight and cost by about 30%. But we also recognize the risks would be, would it meet the fatigue life required of wind turbine blades? So the team on this was GE, the wind turbine division, Virginia Tech, and NREL locally. So high risk. We established very specific goals around fatigue, and so about 15 months into the project, we finally got to the point that the project that the blades would meet the fatigue criteria that they had set out. But at that point, they'd had to add so much additional structure that we were only going to get a 3 to 4% improvement in weight and cost. And so we had the quarterly review meeting, looked at that data, and there's some silence in the room, and I said, I'm just not sure I'm that excited about this project anymore. And GE said, they concurred with that. But the success in this is that we had definitively shown that this really potentially impactful concept was not viable. And so we mutually agreed to terminate the contract. The majority of the funds came back to be redeployed at other programs. We did put some funds aside. There was a couple of students that actually needed to write up their dissertations, and we were able to take care of that. So, to quote Edison, after he had tested 8,000 materials for light bulb filaments, he said, I didn't fail 8,000 times. I found 8,000 things that didn't work. ARPA-E is a lot like DARPA in that it's fast response. Other parts of the Department of Energy work on long-term roadmaps. You know in photovoltaics kind of what they're going to be focusing on in the next 5 to 10 years. ARPA-E intentionally doesn't have that sort of roadmap. A program director comes in and is able to immediately propose that, hey, here's a problem no one's addressing. It's a problem of national importance. Let's figure out what a program would look like to address that problem. The agencies have what they call special hiring authority, which means that program directors come in for a fixed period of time. They're able to go around some of the normal hiring practices. They're able to get really bright folks, ambitious folks to come in, but you only come in for a fixed period of time, roughly for 3 years. I was asked to stay a 4th year, and then now I've continued on with a small role to help maintain some industry relationships. But there are some differences. DARPA, so this is basically the functions of the profile of DARPA. DARPA has one customer. It's the U.S. defense establishment. ARPA-E doesn't have a guaranteed customer, so we have a very strong focus on T to M, technology to market. We mostly do what we call cooperative agreements, but we also have other opportunities that we bring in recent PhDs as fellows. And at the end of the talk, I'll talk about that if you've got, if you're a PhD student graduating, going to be an ARPA-E fellow is one of the best gigs that I could think of in this space. We have a process that's good to understand, around envisioning a program. It's basically up to the program directors to think of, find a problem, think of a way to address that. Then there's a workshop, and this is important because every program has to have a workshop. Not every workshop results in a funded program, but and the workshops are public. Not only that they're going to occur, but the materials at the workshop are typically public. So this is a leading indicator. This tells you what ARPA-E is thinking about. You can go to their website right now, look for the workshops, and that tells you what programs are likely to be coming down the pike. And that's useful because from a workshop to an actual release of a solicitation from the announcement of a workshop to release of a solicitation is generally probably 6 months. So that gives you some time, if you think you'd be competitive in that area, to build a team. In some cases at CSU, if there's a workshop and we've got a team that's competitive in it, we may invest some funds for them to maybe do some experimental work and get some early data that might enhance the prospects of the proposal. And then there's program approval, and we develop a FOA, and then it's released. And so this is, at this point, once the FOA has been released, that's, then you have probably 6 weeks to prepare your proposal. But you actually have probably 6 months if you look early at what workshops are coming down the pike. And then there is, depending on how the program's structured, in some cases we have concept papers, which are a 4-page document, and you select the concept papers, and then you're invited to submit a full proposal. There would be proposal reviews, there's an opportunity to rebut those, then there's project selections, contract award and negotiations, and then there's ongoing technical reviews. ARPA-E practices what's called active program management. That means essentially that every quarter an ARPA-E team is going to show up in your facility to monitor your progress. So when I would show up, there's typically 3 of us. It'd be myself as a program director. I would have a technical specialist, we call them tech CETAs, and I would have a commercialization specialist. And we'll spend essentially half a day going through your progress. And it's progress towards the goals that are not only technical, but they're techno-economic and commercialization. So when I would show up at a project review, the first thing we would do is go through their techno-economic analysis to show if they were still on track to meet their cost targets. Then we'd go through the commercialization plans, and then we would go through the technology. Everyone does it differently, but I chose that order to emphasize the role of the techno-economic analysis and the commercialization in the success of a project. ARPA-E has a set of framing questions built around George Heilmeyer was the founder of DARPA, and he had these various questions that they would ask. But of these, the most important that really is, if it works, will it matter? There are a lot of interesting problems out there, but they're not all important. But almost all the important problems are interesting. So we'll often get really innovative concepts, but you look at them and say, but if it works, it's not really going to move the dial on any of our mission areas. So we really are looking for, we're not looking for singles, we're looking for home runs. And this kind of alludes to what I was talking about earlier on learning curves. If you look at the progression of PV or wind turbines, it's been this march of successive improvements. ARPA-E seeks ideas that may be much higher cost right now or lower performance right now, but if we were to invest money in them, they might be able to beat the existing curve. Now, along the way, we know that a bunch of those are going to fail. And in fact, we embrace failure. About a year ago, Smithsonian is considering doing an exhibit on failure. And they brought together a workshop, and so I was invited to be the keynote speaker on failure. And I'm not sure how, if I actually want to put that on my CV. But basically, they would say in the 1880s, the existing learning curve was the horse and buggy. As Henry Ford said, if I ask my customers what they want a faster horse. But we had, even from the 1700s, we had mobile engine-driven devices, steam-powered and gasoline-powered cars. But it was really Henry Ford and the combining of several different technologies to drive down the cost that really allowed this to become a truly disruptive technology. I've talked about this, and I think this is a redundant slide. I will say that if you wait until the solicitations come out, you've missed some opportunity. Really understanding what's coming down the pipeline is really the opportunity for early engagement. And I'll just say that we're going to be talking today a lot about the open FOA, the open solicitation. And actually, I'll come to that in a moment. So we have four funding, four types of programs that we run. We have focused FOAs, and these are programs in a specific area. One that I launched was called Monitor. It was around methane detection quantification. And so it's got a very precise set of metrics. And most programs are typically, nominally, we say they're about $30 million, and projects can be, from 1 to 3 years. There's really no numbers. Typically, we can fund up to $10 million, but a prototypical project is probably a 3-year, $3 to $4 million project. We do fund projects under $1 million, and we've funded projects up to right at $10 million. Then we have the open FOAs. Again, no set technical focus, just send us your cool ideas in energy. Typically, those have been about $150 million. That's not a guaranteed number. And again, these are 1 to 3 year projects. They typically have been every 3 years. So we had one in 2009, one in 2012, one in 2015. There is no certainty on whether there is an open solicitation next year, but you can look at the trends, and 2018 would be a logical year for the next open solicitation, but it is subject to the availability of funds. We also have a program called IDEAS, and these are smaller projects, and they can be in any typical area, but they're typically under $500,000 and typically a year or less. But in a year where there's expected to be an open FOA, then there's going to be less opportunities typically for these IDEAS projects. Then we also have SBIR, small business and STTR projects, because there is a requirement to set aside some funds specifically for small businesses. Those are typically attached to another program. A little more detail in these. The focus programs, just picking out a few of these. GenSets was a program to develop small, high-efficiency engines for combined heat and power in homes. Focus was one of Howard's projects that he may talk about, but it was focused on improving the efficiency of solar systems by combining what was the concept? It was, as I say, heat and...
Concepts from photovoltaics and solar thermal to get storage out of highly efficient, to get integrated thermal storage, because thermal storage is so expensive.
Impact was around carbon captures. Switches was on advanced power electronics. Delta was around personal cooling. Arid was focused on dry cooling for power plants. Enlightened is a project to develop essentially window films to turn single pane windows into more high efficiency windows. Mariner is around macroalgae for energy. Let's see. Terra is around plant phenotyping. There's a program called Roots that's focused on phenotyping of roots. Electrofuels was around re-engineering biology to make fuels. Grids is around re-envisioning how we structure the grids. And ionics is around solid polymer electrolytes. So just there's more, and these are all described on the website, but it's a wide array of devices. So it really says that that ARPA-E is really interested in anything that spans the gamut of energy, and again, going back to those 3 missional areas. A couple just to talk about a little more detail. These are from FY14. They're ones I'm more familiar with. Monitor was a program I launched. It was around methane quantification and methane detection quantification. In this case, it was 11 projects, a little over $30 to $33 million. And then there's been another, essentially about $5 million putting in that have been invested to create a test facility that allows those technologies to be tested. And ARPA-E has established various test facilities for specific programs. But these technologies, they not only had to show that they could meet metrics for the sensitivity of their device. We had a very specific metric around the cost of measurement that they had to meet. And they also had to present a convincing case that they could ultimately get the technology, that they had a plan for commercializing the technology if successful. And we'll have a case study from one of the monitor projects this afternoon. Again, then the open FOAs, again, every 3 years, $150 million. They get, I'm not sure I'm allowed to say the number, but it'd be very typical to get over 1,000 proposals for an open solicitation. But it's a fairly humane process. There's basically a 4-page concept paper, and if your concept paper is encouraged, then you are invited to submit a full proposal. And putting together a full ARPA-E proposal is a big job. It's very rigorous technically. You have to establish the credibility of your idea, of your team. You have to present, typically data, and then you've got to present the case that if it works, that there's actually a path for the forward for the technology. And again, whether or not there's an open FOA in 2018 is really going to be subject to the next, to the funding negotiations, which are currently underway. We've talked about the open solicitation, but one thing I would say on this, that it can be in any area, but it needs a champion. So basically, if you go, which means that you need to get a program director interested in your idea. And the bios of all the program directors are on the website. So if you had a concept in a certain area, go to the ARPA-E website, read their bios, identify it's probably maybe 1 or 2 or 3 program directors that look like they might resonate with in that area. Contact them directly, buy a plane ticket, call up and say, hey, I'm going to be in DC in a couple of weeks. Can I have a half hour to talk to you about this concept? If you go to the ARPA-E website and look at their funding opportunities, you'll see a lot of announcements, but we can interpret those a little bit. These are the ideas. These are the 500K announcements. Again, that's typically any time, but you need a champion. And there are times when the ideas program may not be active. And typically, if they would be maybe anticipating an open solicitation. We have the focused FOAs, and we've talked about those. There's SBRs and STTRs, and there's the open FOAs, and then there are teaming list announcements. And even before once a project concept has been essentially approved, they may put out a teaming announcement, and that's usually an indication that you could expect a solicitation within maybe another month or so. So a teaming list announcement gives you another early indicator that a solicitation is going to be imminent. But unlike a workshop, there's a lot of ways for a workshop concept to die before a program comes out. But if a teaming list announcement comes out, that does mean that there is an intention to issue a solicitation shortly. So this is actually just what's on the ARPA-E website right now. Just a thought on this. There's the ARPA-E announcement of the Energy Innovation Summit, which will be in March. And I would encourage you, if you haven't been to a summit, to go to the summit. Get someone to pay for your ticket. Typically there'll be 300 or 400 of the projects on display. All the program directors are there, so it's an opportunity to set up a meeting with the program director and maybe pitch a concept to him and get some immediate feedback. The program directors will give presentations on the types of things that they think are interesting, and that may be an early wink that maybe there's going to be a program in that area. But right now, there's workshop announcements for long-term stationary energy storage, high efficiency, high temperature modular power, and high efficiency hybrids. You kind of keep watching for these, and as soon as an announcement comes out, then I would advise you to be proactive, to fight for a workshop invite. Basically, typically you'll have 20, 30, 40 thought leaders in this area. And the workshop is typically, a day and a half long. And that's an opportunity to get to know the program director, for him to know you, and for you to interact with other people in the community. And so, attending a workshop is really advantageous in putting together a program. The presentations will be online, and if the program director typically makes a framing presentation, and so even if you aren't able to attend the workshop, you can go online and get access to these framing presentations. And if you've had a workshop, you could expect that if a program comes out of this, it would occur sometime within 4 to 12 months. It just depends. The process of a program director pitching a workshop is a brutal process. We call it, it's like Shark Tank, only on steroids. And so there's times that programs may need to be revised. In my case, with the monitor program, I initially had proposed both monitoring of methane and mitigation of leaks. And ultimately, the feedback was, that the $30 million available wasn't enough to do both tasks. Figure out which one I wanted to do and come back and repitch the concept. And ultimately, that was the right decision. So again, these are just this is just more readable titles of the workshops that are currently on the website. Actually, I think I want to move beyond that. Talk a little bit about the structure of the ARPA-E structure. You've got a director of the agency who's externally focused, works with Congress, but ultimately approves new projects, new programs and projects. Then you have deputy directors. There's one for technology, one for commercialization, one for administration. They work with the director and then the program directors to make sure that there is continuity and consistency across programs. But the team that you would really be working with is a team that would consist of a program director, a technology and market specialist, and tech CETAs. And it took me a while. It took me like 2 weeks to figure out what people talked about tuxedos, and it was tech CETAs. And so finally figured out that these are they're contractors, but with very detailed technical depth. So in the monitor program, we were getting a lot of concepts that involve spectroscopy. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've spent time in the oil and gas industry. I understand the problem. I'm not a spectroscopist. And so we brought on board an analytical chemist who's a great analytical, he's a PhD analytical chemist. And we also brought on board a PhD systems engineer. And so I had 2 tech CETAs for the program, and some of the solutions were more systems focused, some were more technically focused. But again, every quarter, a team consisting of a program director, a tech specialist, and a tech CETA will show up. At one point, I had 40 projects. So you can just do the math on visiting 40 projects every quarter. It's a vibrant time. I want to talk about who are the program directors, and it's important kind of understand, so you sort of understand their motivation and sort of their mindset, but also to understand if this might be something that you would be interested in doing. Typically, a program director has a PhD in science or engineering. In the ideal world, they would have some commercialization experience, ideally at a startup, or it could be in an entrepreneurial role at a larger company. Typically, while we've had some classical scientists coming out of research labs, that would be unusual that you would get someone from a GE R&D labs or sort of Bell Labs type environment coming in. They looking for someone who's has a bit of an alpha personality, because when you go into a project, the team you funded are the experts on this. So you've got to take a certain personality type to kind of push back on the team and make sure that they're meeting their objectives. The program directors go through a sort of a Shark Tank in the interview pitch. When they come to interview, they have to pitch a hypothetical program, and so they. And so they're really looking for the kind of the way the program directors, the candidate's mind works, and whether they're able to think in terms of metrics and impacts and the type of things that ARPA-E values. And they really have to be able to address all the concerns, impact, technical success, develop metrics, guide commercialization. But it is and these are the current program directors. And again, if you're thinking about program, it's really interesting. I would advise you to go in and look at the bios of the program directors, because for example, Pat McGrath was his PhD was in nuclear engineering from Berkeley, I think, and he launched a program on fusion. Jen Gerby had worked in HVAC, and she just launched these sensor programs on sensors to improve HVAC systems. Mike Haney had done optics, and he launched an optics program. So just knowing the backgrounds of the program directors also gives you an idea of who you'd want to be talking to. The tech-to-market team. These are basically people with deep depth in commercialization. So they help to scope, manage, advise, and build partnerships to ensure that if the technologies work, there's going to be a path forward to commercialization. The case for working at ARPA-E, it's you are contributing to a better energy future. It allows you to work in really diverse areas with some of the brightest minds in energy. It is very much a startup-like culture. Alan raised you said it's like a VC, and that's true. It is very much a VC, a venture capital like environment, but it's very collaborative. And one of the things that's really cool is, coming from the university world, you spend your time groveling for money. When you're a program director and you call someone up, they take your phone calls, and if you want to have a conversation, people are happy to have those. It is I describe it's a life on the road, and for those in the universities. The universities can execute what's called an intergovernmental personnel agreement. So in my case, basically, the university sold 85% of my time to ARPA-E, and that's important. It's 85%. So I would typically spend a third of my time in D.C., about half of the time on the road with projects, and I tried to be back at CSU 1 day a week to keep my lab and program running. Again, it is a life on the road. So if there's certain times in your personal and professional life that may not work. But if you're at a point in your life when you can do that, it is a tremendous amount of fun. So we're always recruiting. I was, depends on how many programs you run, but I had the opportunity to spend a little over $100 million. Very close-knit community, great support staff, great community of performers, basically being in the labs of all the different universities and small businesses and large businesses. It's a great way to build networks that can benefit you in the future. But the expectations are that you'll conceive programs, do deep dives, hold workshops, manage programs, travel. ARPA-E Fellows are for recent PhDs. It's a 2-year term. They work with PDs on new program formulation. They help manage projects. They screen open ideas. They also get a fair amount of time to do what they want. The fellows are able to travel independently and go, go explore new energy concepts. So if you are nearing the end of your PhD program, I would highly, suggest that you look at the opportunity to be a fellow. We provide scholarships for graduate students. Actually, I say graduate students, it's undergraduate and graduate students, I think, to the annual Energy Innovation Summit. So if you wanted to explore that, if you've got students, I would advise them to apply for scholarship to the summit. It's a great way to meet other students, meet program directors, meet other fellows, and understand if that would be a good opportunity for them. So with that, I think I've pretty much exhausted my time, but I'd be happy to take a couple of questions.
The only thing I wanted to add, if it's on, Bryan took you through a cycle of engagement with an idea and talked about the workshops and made the point about the relationship building as well. Once those FOIAs come out, the conversation you can have with the program directors changes. It's much like the more standard RFPs, broad agency announcements. Once there's something out on the street that is asking for the proposal with that 6-week time frame, as Bryan suggested, you're already a little bit behind, but not only are you behind, but you can't even talk to the same way to the program directors because now the funds are in the open competitive environment. So taking advantage of the pre-FOIA time period is also about that conversation you can have with the agency and also stressing that you don't have to go to the workshops. You can get on a plane and just ask to have an appointment with one of these program directors and talk to them at any time if they're willing to see you. And most often than not, it's just a matter of scheduling. I've had many people who would try to schedule well in advance appointments with these folks. Sometimes that's hard because they're pulled in a lot of directions. Some of the people had strategies, would come and visit me in Washington at DARPA. I don't know about Bryan, but they would kind of come to DC for other things, like they were in town for study sections or other visits, and they had more success with a 24 to 48 hour notice than a 2 to 4 week notice because, as he said, not only are they all alpha types, but they have ADD, so they can't stay in one place for too long. So your shot at getting at them in 24 to 48 hours is actually greater than the 2 to 4 week try to make an appointment. But you really do need to engage before that FOIA comes out on the street because the conversation becomes very, well, I can talk to you, but I have to tell you the same thing I tell everybody else. So.
Yeah, it's also worth, if you are trying to meet with someone, because we spend so much time on the road, there's also time when everyone needs to be at the agency. So have what are called home weeks. So basically, supposedly the first week of the month and half of the third week of the month, you're supposed to be in DC. Truth is, what that means is it's like 3.5 days the first week and a couple of days the third week. Yeah.
One more question?
I'll take one more, yeah.
Hi, I'm John Perkins. I'm the acting program manager at NREL for ARPA-E activities, and as such, I see a lot of program development.
And in your slide where it showed the ARPA-E activities and the workshops, I want to let people, you mentioned very briefly about program directors giving their pitches at the Innovation Summit. And I'd like to let people know that all of those fast pitches are publicly available on the web. You can get the slides and you can actually view them on YouTube. Last year there were 18, I think. And so that's kind of a preview of what workshops might come out. And when they advertise a workshop, they don't put the program manager's name in the advertisement, but if you look at the fast pitches, there's a pretty good chance you can figure out who the program manager is and directly contact them.
Good point. This was kind of talking broadly about the agency so you understand the character of the agency. There's also some specific things you want to do to write a competitive proposal, and Howard Brantz will be walking us through that after lunch.
Thank you, Bryan. Let's give him a hand. Thank you.